Go.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to be presenting to you steps for successful secondary transition planning. And we're very excited about this topic because there's a lot to learn around transition. So in our 2020-2021, we are going to be doing a Transition Tuesdays webinar series. So we're very happy you can join us because we're going to be giving you an overview on that today. I am Diane Perry, a parent advisor at the PEAL Center, and that is my contact information in there. And my co-host today.
Hi, I'm Michael Stoehr, and I'm a Knowledge Development and Technical Assistance Specialist for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, or NTACT. And my contact information is also listed on this slide.
Great. So the PEAL Center, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are the Parent Training and Information Center in the state of Pennsylvania. This graphic represents the 6 key strategies used by PEAL to accomplish our work. Families and youth are at the center of our work, as you can see with the hands that are in there, surrounded by the communities and the professionals who work with them. And then surrounded around that is all of the key components of what we do and all the services that we provide at the PEAL Center. As a parent advisor, I do a lot of the individual assistance, helping families navigate the special education system. And then what we're doing today, we do some training. But we also have several of the other pieces that are in this circle here: outreach, resources, and partnerships and leadership development.
And as I mentioned, I work for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, or NTACT. Our primary purpose is to work with state education and vocational rehabilitation agencies, local agencies, both education and VR, as well as our agency partners across the country. We implement evidence-based and promising practices to ensure that students with disabilities, including those with the most complex support needs, are successful once they leave high school and go into adult life, particularly focusing on those post-secondary goals of further training, employment, and living independently in their communities.
So today, participants will be able to describe the topics that will be covered in depth via a series of webinars for families and youth about the secondary transition process. And we're also going to be listing and defining key components of the secondary transition process, because secondary transition can be very complex. So we're going to hopefully try and break that down for you through this series. But first, we wanted to start off with the law. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is also IDEA. And in 2004, the primary purpose that is actually in the law is, I'm going to read that for you, to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. The most important piece here is just understanding that this is in the law, and transition is designed to meet each and every child's unique needs and how you are going to be preparing for the future. So when does formal planning begin? In Pennsylvania, it's called Chapter 14. We have special education regulations, and transition services must be addressed in the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, of the student in the year in which the student turned 14 years of age. So that is when formal transition planning starts. But actually, you can start planning as soon as your child is born or as soon as they're in school. The IEP team does not have to wait until that student is approaching 14th birthday. So you can actually be thinking about transition all the way up, but the formal planning is 14.
So when we talk about secondary transition, we think of it conceptually as a bridge between school programs and all of the opportunities for adult life. Secondary transition isn't done in isolation, however. It involves the family, the young person, and then all of the partners. So the partners both within the school system, so the special education teachers, the general education teachers, as well as all the specialists, the occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech language therapists, and counselors. But then it also involves outside agency supports and providers. Secondary transition is individualized, just like the IEP. And it builds on student strengths and interests and preferences. And again, as Diane was saying, it addresses those outcome areas for further training, employment, and living independently in the community once the student graduates. It also identifies services and supports that that student needs to be successful while they're both in school and once they graduate. As I mentioned, secondary transition does involve many partnerships. So if you look at this slide, it's talking about this coordinated effort. It is vital that the family is engaged in this process along with that youth, and that we truly are person-driven in what we are doing in the secondary transition process. It involves a coordination between the school staff, the family, and the youth, as well as outside agencies, supports, and services. And this begins at 14. It's not waiting until, a couple months before that student graduates. It's an ongoing process that starts in middle school through high school to support that student so they can be successful in adult life.
So I am also, I shared earlier that I work at the PEAL Center, but I also wear that hat of a parent of a child who went through special education services. And that's my son, David, who's 27 now. And I love this slide because this is something that I really found that was helpful for me as a parent and for him as we were going through transition. And that's starting with a vision. And you have to think big. You have to be thinking about all of these things for your child as they're getting older. Some questions you might want to be thinking about is, what does your child enjoy doing? Where does he or she enjoy being? What kind of jobs might fit in these interests? So there's so many things to think about as far as, that vision building. And we did a lot of vision building with our son, David, through something called person-centered thinking, person-centered planning tools. And that was really helpful for not only me, but all the people who supported David and where he wanted to go with his life. He was the one always saying to us, at least when we were home, he didn't want to live at home anymore. He wanted to, once he graduates, he wants to move out, when he was in school, he wanted to go to college, and we had to really listen to him and think as not only parents, but as the professional supporting him in school. All right, what are those steps that we need to do in school now in order to get him to that big vision and that big, where he wants in his dream of what he wants to do for his birthday, for when he gets older, as he gets older. So it's really important that families really think about that future. And when I talk to families, when they call into the PEAL Center, I really say to them, well, what does your child want to do? You're going to have to eventually hand it over to them. And so now is the best time to start doing that while you're in school, when you have all these supports to be able to help you go through those steps. So this is where we're going to start to introduce to you the secondary transition process. And we're going to we figured we had 8 areas of focus that we're going to go over with you. And we're just going to give you a snippet of what to look forward to in that webinar series that Michael and I will be presenting to you at a future date. And you'll see that in the beginning here too.
So as we go through the secondary transition process, and as Diane mentioned, we're going to cover these 8 major topic areas. Know, however, that they all do interrelate to each other. So while we are going to be covering 8 months throughout the year, through the 2020-2021 school year, we are going to hit upon all of these topics, but know that while they are independent sessions, they all do interrelate. So we're going to start with talking about youth and young adult driven focus for the entire process. As we mentioned a few slides ago, it is an individualized process, secondary transition, but it also really is dependent on that student's interests, their strengths, and their needs. We mentioned the importance of engaging with outside agencies and ensuring that the family and the young person is aware of what supports are available and how to connect to those supports. We're going to address secondary transition assessment and then how that impacts helping that young person and their family figuring out what they want to do once they leave school. And that's the post-secondary goal areas for further training, employment, and independent living. We're then going to talk a little bit about what does that process look like for that student while they're in school. So they have their IEP, and as part of the IEP is a transition section. So starting at age 14 until that student exits high school, we have a transition section that's completed by the school. In that system, in that section of the IEP, it addresses post-secondary goals for further training, employment, and independent living. There's a section in there about the courses of study or the classes that the student will be engaged with for that school year. There's also a section that talks about the activities that the student will be engaged in that will help them once they leave school. Again, in those three big areas of further training, employment, and independent living once they leave school. We'll also address looking at measurable annual IEP goals, how those are written, what their focus is, and how they also impact and support that student once they leave school. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the fact that this is an ongoing process. It's not a once and done type of system. It starts at age 14 or earlier if the IEP determines that, and really goes all the way up until that student graduates and is given a summary performance when they exit school. So we're going to break these down, and Diane and I next are going to go through these 8 areas and talk about them in a little bit more depth, just to give you a quick glimpse of what to expect in the months ahead. So we're going to start first with this idea of this whole process being youth and young adult driven. We know through research and studies and really just interacting with youth and young adults that they are most engaged when they feel like they are being listened to. When students and youth are given the opportunity to make their own decisions, when they feel respected, when they are engaged in the conversation and what they say is really valued and viewed as important in the planning process, that they're not being judged, that they're being asked for their opinions, that we're taking the time to really have that student understand the process and understand their engagement in the IEP and in their educational planning, that they truly do have a voice in this process. What you can do now as a family member and as you're thinking about this is really to help your student, your son, your daughter, identify their needs and look at what they're really good at and what they're interested in. Help them at home in making decisions, especially during the times that we're living in now with COVID, and we're home a lot now, right? And students oftentimes, depending on the school district you're in, you may be doing virtual learning or you may be completely at home. Engage your son or daughter in making decisions. Engage them in activities that they can be doing at home. Enhance their communication skills, be that on a phone with texting or possibly, sending emails or talking on the phone to someone. Develop their skills and celebrate the successes that they are having and encourage them, and have them start thinking about the future and what they want to do once they leave school. And really look at engaging with not only your school team, but the outside agency supports. And have it not just you, the family members do that, but make sure that your sons, your daughters, the young people in your life are engaging in this process.
Okay. So the next section will be outside agencies collaborating with schools and families. And I'm just going to highlight that, really excited about our very first series that Michael just talked about, because engaging that youth is going to be really important. And lessons learned as a parent, and that's why I'm saying that, is that, we have to step away and eventually hand it over to them. We're not going to be here on this good earth. So, hope, depending on situations, but, you really want to be able to hand that over and know that your child is making those decisions. So I really love that we're doing that one first. So, but the second one is involving and inviting agencies to that IEP meeting. And there's all various agencies that you can be inviting. The invitation must include agencies when it's appropriate for them to be invited. So when you're starting out right in the beginning at 14, there might be certain agencies that don't need to be at the table yet, but as you go through this transition process, do know that there are other agencies that should be invited. If an agency is likely to provide or pay for services. So there's one of the agencies could be the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, OVR. You might start hearing those letters and hearing about OVR, about coming to the table, because they do pay and provide different services for your child while they're in school, and then once they actually exit, and that's when they really pick up. But you need to get to know some of these agencies prior to actually leaving the school system. And all of this is with parent permission. So it's really important that the parent gives permission that these agencies come to the table. One of them may come to the table and, you know, you may not need them, and that's okay, but at least you get to hear and give permission to actually hear from these various agencies that might be able to provide some services. You know, there's the Office of Intellectual Disabilities. If your child has an intellectual disability, there might be some services that you could get from them. If your child doesn't have an intellectual disability, then you may not need their services. So, but it's really important that invitations are sent out and that you give approval for that. So parents and youth can also connect with these agencies prior to the IEP meeting. So I will tell you that my son, David, does experience an intellectual disability. So I was already familiar with a couple agencies prior to entering the transition phase, so to speak, with the school through the IEP. So I did have some relationships with some of these agencies, and I, you know, would say, you know, can we have this one come to the table for this, because this is what's happening with David. So, you know, just know that you're working with your team. This is a whole team collaboration, as Michael said earlier. We're all working together to help that child, help that youth be successful. The school district should provide resources and explain the role of each of these agencies, because you may not be familiar with a lot of them. I recently spoke to a family member and she was like, well, why do I even want to have them? I said, well, the school should be telling you why, but here's why you may want them there. And she was like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So, you know, just making sure that if you're as a parent, sometimes, you know, you're like, you know, you feel like maybe you should know everything, and you don't, because really transition is so complex. You're not going to know everything and all the names. Ask questions at your IEP meeting. Who are they? What can they do? You know, anything like that. Especially if the school district is proposing to have them come to a meeting with you. So, you know, just really, and also, Michael and I presented at an annual transition conference this past summer, which is held every year. That would be something else that I would really encourage families to do. So, and youth, because that transition conference held every year in the summertime is really filled with all kinds of information and really lots of resources for you to connect with. And it can be overwhelming, but you know what? You have plenty of time. You have a couple of years. You're starting at 14, and if your child is going to stay and receive services till 21, you have a couple of years there to really, you know, go to the conference a few times and really absorb some of the information.
Okay, so next up, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of age-appropriate transition assessment as part of not only the IEP process, but also the secondary transition process. And when we talk about assessment and transition assessment, it's important to note that it's not the same thing for all students. That it's not something that is just done once, either like right before the IEP meeting or at the end of school. That it's an ongoing process, and it builds from year to year in helping that young person and their family have a good understanding of that individual's strengths, their needs, and their interests. It's based also upon where that student currently is, based again on where they are. Maybe it's related to their disability. So for example, if the student has an intellectual disability, ensuring that the assessment is geared for that young person to be as successful as in taking that assessment as possible. It's also a process that increases that young person's awareness, as well as the families, about what they are good at and what they need help with. It also helps in really planning for that entire IEP process. So it should, in the present education levels of the IEP, should outline not only the results of the assessment, but those assessments results should be interpreted and then be utilized in both transition planning, but also in the planning for those measurable annual goals, and also should influence what that student is doing regarding their activities and services that they're receiving by the school district. It's also important to note that it's not just the responsibility of one person. You know, that special education teacher, for example. It really is a cumulative effort of everybody involved with that student, including you as a family member, as well as the student, you know, talking about what their interests are. So, you know, just to make this clear, that oftentimes I think assessment was considered, oh, we're going to take a test. It's not that. It really is this ongoing process. So when we think about transition and transition assessment, think about what you as a family member or you as that young person are learning from the assessment process. Where is that information being listed? And how's it interpreted? And do you understand it? And it's okay if you're sitting down at an IEP meeting and you don't understand something that's written in that report. Ask questions. Say, what does that mean? Or if a student is struggling, say, for example, in the area of math, what do they need help with and how can they improve? And what does that assessment tell us that is helping guide this process? So it's really important to take a step back and ask questions and really understand, you as that family member and you as that young person, what all was involved in that assessment process. So the next piece we're going to talk about is looking at these big areas or these broad areas related to secondary transition. So really looking at further training, employment, and independent living. These are those big bucket goal areas. So as we mentioned, age-appropriate transition assessments drive this process, really looking at what that student is interested in and would like to do someday. It's not the same, these post-secondary goals, as measurable annual goals. Measurable annual goals, remember, are based upon the needs that that student has, and they're related more to the academic areas, so math, reading, writing, as well as those functional need areas, behavior areas, organizational areas. That's what the measurable annual goals are. The post-secondary goals, they're related to what that student wants to do once they leave school. Regarding, again, if they want to go on for, say, college or a training program, what are those areas that they're interested in and what do they need to be successful? It's also related to competitive integrated employment. What kind of job do they want to have someday? And then looking at where they want to live someday. And Diane mentioned about her son David wanting to live outside the home. That was a goal that he had while he was in high school. So what steps would need to be taken to ensure that that could happen once that student exits high school? Again, these statements are something that reflects something that will occur once the student leaves school. They're not statements that talk about what happens while the student is in school.
So then we need to start thinking about that thoughtful course of study, which is also part of the IEP as well. And what are the courses of study? I will say that a lot of families sometimes don't understand this process and what the courses of study really is. But what it is, it's a coordinated set of activities that helps student move from high school to those identified post-secondary goals that Michael was just, referring to, and what those post-secondary goals will be in those three big bucket areas. Okay. Decisions on appropriate courses of study are team decisions. So that includes the youth, that includes the parent and all the professionals involved that are supporting the student to be able to be successful. Courses selected should support post-secondary goals. Inclusion in the general education curriculum is, of course, a consideration for the team as well. We did choose for David, he was still in those general ed classes, taking courses, but a lot of the courses he chose, were things that hopefully were going to help him attain those post-secondary goals that he wanted, because he did want to go to college. So he's going to need to continue taking those reading, writing, math type of courses. If a work-based learning, which would include community-based vocational training or work experience or community-based instruction, it's part of an actual course. List it by the exact name as it is listed in the list of courses. So you actually have to put the name of the course in there. And that's why I wanted to put that in there, because I know sometimes, like David, he actually did do VOTEC, but you have to actually put the actual name of the course on the IEP. List of courses needs to reflect the current year's courses. So if the schedule or course selection changes during the duration of the IEP, a revision is going to be needed. And sometimes that happens because sometimes courses are only a half a year, like a fall or a spring. So you're going to have to reconvene and make that change so that it is correct on the IEP and written correctly. Okay. Now the transition services and activities, again, these need to align with the post-secondary goals. So what exactly are transition services and activities? So this is how do we assist a student reaching his or her dreams? Okay, I'm going to go back to that vision. How are you actually, helping that child reach those dreams? One way is by structuring the services and the activities, also known as action steps, directly related to their post-secondary school goals. These services and activities must occur during the duration of the IEP, and there must be at least one activity and service for each of these 3 areas. Okay. Now I'm going to give you more detail on the next slide, but each of these one service needs to be tied to that goal to address that particular deficit, for example, in reading or writing or behavior. So, and then one activity also needs to be listed as well on that IEP, okay, for each of those goal areas. So here's a little bit more detailed information. Here's your service column, and then there's your activities columns. So the services address the skill deficits, and they also lead to measurable annual goal and progress monitoring, which is also going to be important because you want to be able to see, what is the progress? Are they actually making progress on this? And you might need to revisit that. And then we just list some examples. I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can read them on the slide as far as what some of the examples could be. And one of them might just be initiating peer interaction as you become a teenager, as you go out into the world, whether, for employment, you're going to have some type of interaction, and it could be an independent part of that independent living piece as well. That peer interaction is going to be really important in getting through life. Now, the activities help a student achieve the post-secondary goals, and they don't need to be a measurable annual goal. And again, here are some examples listed there. Maybe they just need to go visit a college or a job fair. David had to attend he wanted to go to college, so he had to go through that. He had to, go on certain websites as well, to find out about different colleges, and some of them maybe had a virtual tour or something like that. So these are things that are activities that list then on the IEP.
So we also wanted to just highlight one particular area of the post-secondary goals, looking at competitive integrated employment. And in looking at that, we wanted to talk a little bit about this slide where it's looking at career exploration experiences. We wanted to highlight this because we wanted to show that it is an ongoing process. As we mentioned, transition in Pennsylvania starts at age 14, so that's usually middle school or first year of high school, and it goes until the student exits school when they graduate or age out at age 21. When we think about this process, it actually starts earlier even than looking at high school, right? And Diane mentioned, you need to start thinking about transition early. And we oftentimes will tell families, really, when that student enters into the special education system, even in first grade, start thinking about what is that ultimate goal that that student wants to have once they leave school. Where do you see, where does that young person see themselves living, working, being successful? So when we think about this continuum of career exploration experiences, it first starts with an awareness. And that's really that initial self-exploration. What do I want to do when I grow up? Those types of discussions. It could involve looking at different types of jobs. Volunteering is also really important and can't be started soon enough. Volunteering in your community, maybe it's at a food bank, or maybe it's doing some outside work at your church or your local community center. But those types of activities are really helpful to your sons or daughters, the young folks you're working with. And then you look at, as you have that awareness piece, then you move along this continuum, really looking at further exploration. Once you kind of decide, that young person decides in a particular career cluster area that they want to look at, then it's preparing for that. And then engaging more intensely in actual employment experiences that lead eventually to the very last piece, as that student is out of school, engaged in a competitive integrated employment job. So kind of keep this in mind, that it is a process, and it's a process that we work on. That's really what secondary transition is all about. And as Diane mentioned, it oftentimes will change and does change from what that young person wants to do in 9th grade until they what they actually end up doing once they leave or exit school. So we're next going to move on to talking about measurable annual IEP goals and how they link to those areas of further training, employment, and independent living. So transition goals are listed in the IEP, as you're aware of. And if a goal is listed in the IEP, at least one of those goals need to be linked to either the post-secondary goal area of further training or employment or independent living. And Diane mentioned that. So for each of those, when you look at, for example, post-secondary education and training, you should be able to find a measurable annual IEP goal connected to that. It could be a goal regarding reading or writing or math, perhaps, or it could be an organizational goal that is linked to that, or possibly a behavior goal of interaction or peer interaction. But there should be a connection because the IEP process really should be focused on secondary transition for kids that are 14 and older. When writing IEP goals, it's important that the condition, the student's name, the clearly defined behavior, and then how that goal is going to be evaluated are individualized and are based on assessment for that student. We're going to talk just a little bit about that in looking at this grid example. So this section that you're looking at on the screen now is taken from a Pennsylvania IEP, and it's looking at the transition section, or section 3 of the IEP in Pennsylvania. What you'll notice on this particular slide is this is an independent living goal. And this is for Devin, and he has a goal of living independently in the community without supports. You'll notice over in the right-hand column, it says, is there a measurable annual goal? And it says that yes, there is. And then we go down here, and you'll see he has his courses of study that Diane went over. These are the classes that he's taken. And then we go down under the services and activities. Now, the highlighted one or area with the star is actually one that's connected to a measurable annual goal. And that is preparing and cooking meals for the day while using health and safety precautions in the kitchen. He's going to be engaged with this while in his high school class. And there will be a corresponding goal connected to this. He also has one activity listed here, and that activity is to work on budgeting skills and financial finances in the community. So this is Devin's measurable annual IEP goal, that he will be able to prepare 3 hot or cold meals in one day using health and safety precautions while making the meals with 100% accuracy. So perhaps this is in a home ec class that he's involved with, or maybe in his life skills class that he's involved with. The teacher is going to observe and have a checklist on how well he's doing, and then that will be evaluated and reported back on to the family and the young person quarterly.
So then we're going to be moving on to secondary transition process that includes the progress monitoring and the assessment. All IEPs must be updated annually. And you should know that, especially if you're into transition and you've been having an IEP for a while. And this should include updates to assessment data related to post-secondary transition, as well as updates to post-secondary goals based upon the assessment data and the progress monitoring. So you look at your it's like we have it like steps here, the post-secondary goals and the assessment data, and it must be updated at, we say they're starting at age 16 because in federal law, it's 16. But as I stated earlier, Chapter 14, which is the state regulations in Pennsylvania, say we start transition at 14. So if you move to New Jersey or to another state somewhere, it may be 16. So that's why we want to make sure that you know that difference of the state. And then you go up that next step, which is it's reflected in the present levels in the IEP. So all that assessment data, the progress monitoring, all that, you're going to see that in the beginning of the IEP where it says, present levels. So you want to make sure that present levels actually has present information. Like you don't want to, at this stage of the game when you're 14, there shouldn't be things like, childbirth went really well, there was no complication, like you don't include things like that because you're talking about transition, and a lot of that information is irrelevant once you get to that age. So you just be clear that it's present, more current. And then like I include current assessment data. So, and again, it's in each of those areas: education, training, employment, independent living. We can't focus enough or say this enough, Michael and I, about these 3 different areas. They're really important to really, keep that going into all 3 of those areas. Now, your child, your youth might not need something in each of one of these areas. And sometimes I think it's really important when we think about independent living, we have to think about that in a real broad way. So when we talk about that vision and in the future, think about broadly, because I do find in my experiences with talking to other families, well, independent living, well, that means, cooking, shopping, things like that. But you know what, when you think about it, well, what if your child does want to go to college? Can they really live in that dorm by themselves? What do they need to know about budgeting? So when you think about independent living, there's a lot of pieces to consider. So, and in considering that, there are many transition planning tools that are out there, and we have some of them listed on the screen here, and I'll give a snippet of a few of them. But a really good transition starts with really good planning. Okay, so you really need to be able to be planning about this, and there are many tools out there to really help, not only with the assessments and the student interest and skills, but also helping that the whole community really figure out, how can we help this student? How can we help the individual? Person-centered thinking sometimes can be difficult. I remember when we first started doing some of these tools with David, we did, the path and the math with its actual maps, and which is actually planning ahead. And then, what's that pie in the sky? And then you say, okay, well, what can we do now in order to get to that, North Star? So, and that it's a different type of thinking, because sometimes, as families and youth and professionals, teachers, we're like, oh, we got to get, what are we doing this year? What are we doing this school year? What are we doing next month? Sometimes, we have to really think about what's that future, and is what I'm doing now really going to be able to get me where I'm going? Okay. Really, supported employment and customized employment are really 2 different areas around employment, because not every child with a disability is going to have that traditional, go to college, get a job, or even just like graduate and go get a job. There's a lot of different pieces that might need to be developed around that. So you might need some different type of customization around that. And discovery is a really cool assessment that speaks to, what does that individual do during their day? What do they do, volunteering out, or they do anything out in the community? What are they doing socially? This discovery kind of looks at that individual's whole life, home, socially, behaviorally, and then really gives some really good data and information about, well, we might have to customize a job around this, they might not be able to do a regular, a typical job that, some people just go straight into. And nowadays with COVID and how life is just changing, your typical jobs really aren't typical anymore. The world is really changing in that area. So it's really important that we get good data and assessments. And what that means sometimes is that you have to work backwards. You start now to build for that future, and I can't say this enough. As a family member, we do make the difference. Families do bring a lot to the table. Your voice is really needed at those IEP meetings. Many teachers will say, the parent really, it's just like, they feel like sometimes they're just going through a checklist, and, but the families, you really need to be engaged in this transition process. And not only the family, but more importantly, the youth, because they're going to be the ones that really need to drive how those services are going to be provided throughout the transition process. When families presume competence and hold high expectations, the youth believe that they are capable as well. And I can't say that enough. We have to presume competence no matter what gifts and talents and challenges our child might give us at home, in school, behaviorally. We always need to be presuming competence. And the other thing that I also want to add here too is that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay if they fail at something, because how else are we going to learn? How else are we going to continue to hold them high? And I know you can do this, even though they might not, all right, it didn't work this time, let's try it again. Continue to have those high expectations. And not just as a parent, but you know, the school personnel also need to have those high expectations. You know, every child is that unique, you know, going back to that law when we said in the beginning, unique needs. Just because a child might have a particular disability, you know, doesn't mean it means like, you know, if you have a child who has autism, you only met one child who has autism. Those unique needs are very individualized. And develop a transition plan for yourself too to move through that process. Just a few other key reminders. Even when the best plans are laid out, lives change. And boy, 2020 has given us a lot to think about the way our lives change. Like we got this all planned out, we're ready to go, and boom, look, COVID hit. You know, things are really changing, and transition looks very different now for a lot of families and a lot of students out there right now. So we're just going to need to learn to adjust our plan and, you know, change with the time. But again, you're not alone in this process. And I'm really grateful that, you know, NTACT and Michael and PEAL, that we've joined together to provide this webinar series. And we're really hopeful that you guys will continue to join us for each of the sessions that we're doing for you, so that you can really help us or that we can help you go through that transition process. You are not alone. There are lots of resources out there, a lot of agencies out there to provide anything that you need. And just don't forget, you just need to ask for help, and that's okay. So this is a copy of the flyer for all of our webinar series. And I think I might have neglected earlier to say that all of them will be held between 12 o'clock or between 12 and 1 on our Transition Tuesdays dates, starting on September 22nd. And all of the dates are listed on the PEAL's website. So feel free to go to our website to actually see the whole list of all the dates that are provided. But as I said, we are starting on September 22nd with our first one, Youth and Young Adult Driven Planning. So I really hope that you will be able to join us for the webinar series. Michael, I'm excited to be doing these with you. You know, I knew Michael when David was younger. He's 27 now, and Michael did a lot of transition and helped us through that process as well. And I'm really grateful that we can be able to bring this series to you.
And we were kids back then in high school. So
yeah, right?
We're not that old.
No, we're not.
The other thing too is the series is being recorded. So just as a reminder to that too, so if you happen to miss one of them, you can always catch up to them, or if you're late joining us and say you're only tuning into this and it's January, know that you can go back and you can capture all of these, watch all these other sessions, you know, in their entirety, because they will also be listed on the PEAL site and you'll be able to access them. So we really are, we're excited that you're joining us for this series, and really hope that it helps you and your sons, daughters, the youth you're working with as they transition from high school into adult life. I wanted to just mention briefly that NTACT, the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, is, we can be found in a variety of social media places. So please feel free to visit our website, which is transitionta.org. We also have a listserv you can sign up for, as well as following us on Facebook, on Twitter. You can find us on Pinterest. And we also have lesson plans for teachers, if you're a teacher watching our series, on Teachers Pay Teachers. And again, you could contact us. You can contact me directly at my email, or you could send a question to our general mailbox, which is ntacmail@uncc.edu.
And again, we just want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you during the webinar series as well. And the PEAL Center is there to help you. There's all of our contact information for you that we can provide any type of service for you around individual assistance, outreach, and obviously more training.
And again, we look forward to you joining our series, and please ask us if you have any questions throughout the upcoming year. So thank you.
Thank you.